All right, good afternoon, British and American culture students. As we talked about on Friday, some people had some issues with the quiz. So this Wednesday at 12:30, not at 12, because some people are trying to finish their class. I heard a few students have class at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, and some other professors are a little bit late letting you go. So rather than rushing out of the class at 12 o'clock, from now on we'll do the quizzes at 12:30. This quiz is not a real quiz, okay? I'm just gonna throw up. I actually haven't done it yet, but I'm just gonna put an old quiz, maybe even a quiz from a previous year, which is on the same material, okay? But it's not going to count. It's just a mock. It's a mock test, just to make sure that the issue is not with your tablet or with your browser. I heard actually some. I don't know. I'm not a technician, so I can't really say what the problem is, but it may be the browser. It may be if you're on an iPad and you log in using Safari or Edge, or there's different choices. So let's check it out, make sure that you don't have a problem next time. It might be a browser, it might not be your device, it might not be the server, it might be a browser issue. So try different things, okay? Try your phone. It should work though. I don't know what the issue was, but more than one person said they had a problem. So check it out, 12:30 this Wednesday, and see if you can find out what the problem is, okay? That's all I can do. And next Wednesday is a real quiz, not today, but next Wednesday we'll have quiz number 2, which will be the real thing. And it'll also be at 12:30. Now, today, it may appear at first glance that this is a history class, but it is not. This is a culture studies class. So the idea is, of course, there's a lot of crossover between English literature and cultural studies and history. I personally love history. I've always liked it since I was young, and English literature too. So I think that's one of the good things, is that you are going to get some history. The bad thing is that some people don't like history, but I'm not. Although there's a bunch of numbers here, and there's a bunch of, it looks like you're supposed to memorize this stuff. It's not. I want you to focus on what's in the textbook, which focuses more on the events and the ideas, and what the impact of those events and ideas are on British culture, right? On the development of British culture. So we were talking about medieval culture, the characteristics of medieval life. I'm going to continue doing that on Friday, because that's I was talking about the Crusades, and we were talking about religion and so on. Today I'm just going to frame the 14th century, the things that were the major things that are leading up to the crisis of the 14th century, and the major things that happen which affect the future of the evolution of British culture, okay? So, as I explained, there's one date in history, in British history, that people insist that you remember, and that is 1066. That's the Battle of Hastings, where King Harold, an Anglo-Saxon king, the last Anglo-Saxon king, was defeated by the Normans, led by the Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror. Or if you choose to call him something rude or insulting, then William the Bastard. Okay, because as I explained, he was born from the union of the Duke, his father, and a servant, somebody who is not a noble. So he had to overcome all of that and become a great leader and warrior there's lots of controversy about him because, as I explained, at first he attempted to learn English and sort of work with the Anglo-Saxon nobility, but they were rebellious, and especially in northern England, he had problems controlling, keeping the peace. And his solution to that was to go on a warpath and kill everybody he could find. It's called the Harrying of the North. And after that incident, he basically, almost all the noble Anglo-Saxons lost their land and property. As I explained, he basically took possession of the entire kingdom personally. And this will be a sort of a struggle between the kings and the people of England from this point right up until we talk about the 17th century and the Civil War. The struggle between who has the power, the personal power of the king, the aristocracy, the rich, powerful nobles, and the people. This is what will result in the French Revolution. We talked about also the church being part of that power struggle. So, but in England, as I said, there isn't really a real revolution compared to what happens in America or what happens in France. Instead, generally, British culture is very conservative and kind of evolves. That's why the course is called Evolution and Revolution, because it's going to, change gradually, and there's going to be serious protests, revolts, and problems between different parts of society. But unlike a lot of countries or kingdoms or empires, the British culture has a tendency to react after some of these rebellions or revolts or protests. Serious things happen. There is a change in the way society is governed, and it happens step by step. So the first, as I said, we got this very significant change, 1066, when England is ruled by a very powerful king who is a foreigner, who doesn't speak English. So the entire country for hundreds of years is heavily influenced by the Norman culture, and they all speak French. And if you wanted to gain status or success or improve your situation, you had to learn French. Also, you had to speak French. And the Normans, but what happens over hundreds of years, actually, because the Normans are the upper class, they're kind of a layer on top of the Anglo-Saxon society, is that gradually the Normans become anglicized, and what you end up with is like an Anglo-Norman culture. That's by the time you get to the 14th century, the kings of England all speak English. They speak French usually as a first language and English as a second language, but they're all basically starting to do things in English. And there's a lot of reasons why this happens, but fundamentally, the Normans were a small percentage. They were the most important people. They were the wealthiest and the most powerful. And as I said, they built castles everywhere to make sure everybody behaved. But eventually, the population would start to absorb their culture rather than the other way around. Yeah. So, and they of course, kept all those rules and all that power for a long time. But hundreds of years pass. As I said, it's kind of a gradual change, and the fact that instead of spending their time in Normandy and France, as William did, and his son Robert, of course, did until he was imprisoned by his brother, and Richard the Lionheart, the king who went on crusade. I think we talked enough about the Crusades for you to get a sense of what was going on there. But he spent most of his time in France and the Middle East. He was king for something like 15 years, and he only spent like a year out of that time in England itself. Most of the time, his mother Eleanor was in control of England, and in the end, he is captured, and there's a gigantic ransom that has to be paid to release him. He gets released, and then he goes back to northern France. Then he's fighting, and he gets shot by a crossbow bolt, which gets infected, and it kills him. He's a very romanticized king, as you can imagine. Always fighting, always entertaining, fancy courts with a lot of poetry and singing, and of course he went to the Middle East in the Third Crusade, fought against Saladin, and they had these dramatic encounters where they respected each other and were honorable, exchanged prisoners. There was a lot of things. I can't explain all of the story, but Richard the Lionheart is one of the most romanticized kings in English history. As I said, he had a sword he called Excalibur, which is the same sword he claimed that it was Arthur's sword that he was using, in battle. And he was a great warrior. He was not only just a good leader and had a sense of, how to organize in the military, but personally courageous, big, strong, and skilled in battle. So he personally would, kill the enemies with his sword. And this is a time period where that's what a king is supposed to be able to do. He's supposed to be a warrior king, not just a political leader, but a military leader who leads from the front, in which he did. So 1095 was the first crusade. He goes on the third crusade, which is 100 years later. As I told you, Jerusalem had been captured by the Muslims, and the reason Richard was there, ostensibly, was to retake Jerusalem. And he gets within, 25 kilometers of Jerusalem, is unable to take it and has to retreat. And he makes an agreement, a peace treaty with Saladin, and then he returns, as I said. Returns to Europe, gets captured, has to be ransomed with a huge amount of money, and then he's released, and then he fights in France and he dies. His younger brother, John, and there's only one John, so we don't need to call him John the First because there's no John the Second. King John was a terrible king who failed militarily in France, lost a lot of battles. He taxed the people heavily. And as I said, he was some kind of sexual predator. So he was always basically doing criminal behavior towards women who were the wives, sisters, daughters, mothers, cousins of the people who were supporting his kingdom. Okay? So pretty horrible king in all aspects. And because of this, the barons, the wealthy Anglo-Norman leaders, have their own castles and have their own men, their own soldiers. They rebel and they force him to sign the Magna Carta, which is a restriction of his powers. Puts a limit on this absolute power and personal rule of the king. Which I said, he immediately after he signs it, the next year he tries to cancel it and everything, but as a student asked in class, when does it become permanent or whatever, it's not really like that. Just that document, it gets preserved, gets saved. You can see an original copy of it in the museum in England. It's one of the most precious documents, along with Beowulf, the poem, the Old English poem, and things like Canterbury Tales. These documents are preserved in British museums, and it gets reissued, as I said, every time a king is chosen or elevated from being a prince, to becoming the king. They have to recognize the importance of the Magna Carta. So every time it gets reissued, every time there's a new king, that the effect of it gets stronger, essentially, right? To the point where when there's a problem with the king or with the monarchy or the princes, people will refer to the Magna Carta and say, well, this in this document, this states that the king is not above the law, so you have to abide by that, right? So 100 years later, it's basically considered a legal precedent that anybody can refer to when they're having problems with the king. Okay, we got to the point, I think, where we started talking about the 14th century last class and about the famine. As I explained, there was a big climate shift where the weather in general got colder. There's various reasons for this, theories. Gigantic volcanoes exploding and stuff like that, putting material into the air. But generally there's a period called the long summer, which lasts for hundreds of years, which enables England to produce more food and have a bigger population. And that period is over, and there's something called the Little Ice Age, which again lasts for hundreds of years. And this is kind of written into the story of Game of Thrones, where they're always talking about the long summer is over, and the catchphrase in Game of Thrones is "winter is coming," right? So, winter is coming, and the 14th century, we might describe that as the winter, right? There's going to be Game of Thrones is based on various English historical events, including something that happens after the 14th century. But this change in climate negatively affects all of Northern Europe. So there's starvation and famine across Europe, in Germany and France and Belgium and Netherlands, in Denmark, everywhere. The Viking countries, the Scandinavian countries, they're all experiencing the same thing. So even before the Black Death, the disease, the bubonic plague arrives in the middle of the century, you have like these multiple years. It's not just 13, 15, it's about 7 or 8 years where they have very wet, very cold summers, and there's not enough food. So there's a lot of people dying, but even the people that are alive are malnourished. They grow up and their bodies are weak because they haven't eaten properly. That's what happens when you grow up and you don't eat enough food. So when, you can see there's about a 30-year delay. So these malnourished people, these underfed people, they're going to be 30 to 40 years old, which is that's middle age to us, or early middle age to us, but to the medieval people, this is the end of your life, right? 40 years old, you're getting to be an older person. So people in their 30s are particularly vulnerable, and they're the ones that are going to get the Black Death. And it kills, in some places it kills half the people, and it's a terrifying disease to a lot of people because, of course, disease is a very common thing. There's not really any good doctors or hospitals. So they have hospitals, but medicine is not developed to the point where they actually understand how to cure people. They have all kinds of things that you can drink and treatments that you can use, but for the most part these are ineffective, especially to a serious disease. There's no vaccines or understanding about sanitation or anything. They might put some hot stones on your feet and make you drink like some strange potion in order to help you survive, and those remedies didn't work. So this is what people have to deal with. Then when the Black Death comes, it just, as I said, this kind of black and purple swelling, these big lumps that develop on your body. They're called buboes. That's why it's called the bubonic plague. So everybody would recognize that you had it, but there wasn't really anything you could do except for like lock the door and burn the house down with the people in it. As I said, there's some very violent reactions to the plague because there was really it was misunderstood. A lot of things are misunderstood about it. One of the things that people believed was that the plague spread by smell, right? Of course, there's horrible smells all the time. It's a very dirty environment. Any town or city in Europe would have been incredibly dirty all the time with human waste and animals everywhere. All cities were very dirty. You might think that cities are dirty now, but not compared to hundreds of years ago. They were pretty disgusting. The street was always a mess. There wasn't proper sewage or sanitation of any kind. So there was a belief that the smell, the terrible smell from the disease from everywhere was spreading. That's the way that the disease would go from person to person, was through the air, and the smell was an indication that it was spreading. So people would light candles and incense and perfume, and use oils and stuff like that in order to block the bad smell, which they thought was spreading the disease, which of course had nothing to do with it, except for the fact that if the city was cleaner and the house was cleaner and your body was cleaner, you would be safer from the disease. But this is not what they did. They didn't clean everything up. They just lit a candle and tried to cover the bad smell. So the Black Death was a disaster in many ways. Of course, it negatively affected all levels of society, but then, of course, rich people were more able to deal with it, just like with coronavirus. Poor people are affected much more than people who have wealth and the ability to protect themselves. For example, just moving to the countryside and living in a castle away from all the other people in the city was a pretty good solution to get away from it. So a lot of important upper class aristocrats died, but not to the same level, not to the same extent that the peasants did. They suffered way more than any of the wealthy people did. Right before, in addition to the famine, which caused everybody to have problems with food, there was a food crisis, and the climate change, as I mentioned. In addition to that, the Edward III, the King of England at the time, also decided that he was going to claim the throne of France. This is because the King of France dies, and there's no relatives. He doesn't have a son to take over when he dies, and the closest relative through his mother is Edward III. So he claims the throne of France, which the cousins of the king reject. They say that you can only become the king if your father was you through the male line. You inherit the crown. You can't. It's called Salic law. It's true. Usually, Western European countries follow to avoid this problem of who is supposed to be the king. You inherit the throne through your father's side. You can't inherit it through your mother's side. But if you remember, way back in 1066, that was William's claim. His claim to the throne came through the female line, right? Because his great grandmother was related to the king several generations back. So he said he had a claim to the throne. So it's the same sort of argument. Anyway, the French reject it, so the English and the French go to war over who is going to become the King of France. So the from that year, from 1337, for 115 years. It's deceiving because we call it the Hundred Years' War, but basically France and England are at war off and on over who is going to inherit the throne of France for 115 years until 1453. So there's a war. It's not always, it's called the 100 Years' War, but they're not constantly fighting, obviously. You can't keep that going for 100 years, but basically they're not at peace. Even when they're not fighting, there's the possibility of invasion or battles happening at any time because they haven't agreed to peace. There's 2 times that they do have sort of a break. It's like 3 periods to the 100 Years' War. And for the most part, the English have the upper hand. Towards the end of the war, they're going to essentially conquer France, but there's a famous young woman named Joan of Arc, with Jeanne d'Arc in French, who rallies the French people around the Dauphin, and they manage to expel the English and win the war in the end. But for most of the 100 Years' War, the English are the ones that have the upper hand. In the end, though, the English effort in France is going to collapse, and they're going to lose all of their territory in France, which they've had by 1453, they've had that territory for about 400 years. I mean, the kings and queens of France and England are not so different. There was an actual possibility that they would be unified, that there would be one kingdom. France, you imagine if British and French culture, usually French people and English people don't want to talk about this at all, but there was a possibility of these very important rivals becoming one culture and one unified kingdom. But the 100 Years' War is the thing that sort of defines, some French historians say that is how France was born as a country, because there's lots of different regions of France, but it's actually the 100 Years' War that unifies the South and Provence and Brittany and Normandy and Burgundy. These are all like sort of separate kingdoms that it now constitutes France. But the 100 Years' War makes them come together to resist the English, and they reabsorb those territories that belong to the Anglo-Normans, and they will never be disputed again. They will never go back. Some English kings will attempt, or queens will attempt to keep control of some parts of northern France, but never again will they actually be under English control. So you got that. You've got the war, you've got a war with France, and you got the Black Death, and you got all this famine and bad weather happening at the same time. Things are going pretty horribly in England. But they keep fighting anyway, and they do score some impressive victories in France. France is suffering the same problems, right? They have lack of leadership, they have lack of unity, even though they have more people and they are supposed to be, more powerful militarily. They don't seem to be able to put everything together to resist the English. So that the battles go back and forth, but there's some great victories, some of the most legendary victories in English history, Agincourt and Crécy, and several other battles. There's a naval battle. The English win these battles against the French, and this is part of the pride that the British have in their military. We'll talk about the effect of those things later. But at home, the burden on the peasants, the burden on the English people is too much. It's starting to create a lot of resistance, a lot of what would we say? Discontent. Discontent is a mild term. I think the peasant class, the majority of the people in England they get to their limit, where the taxes and the rules and the oppression, the requirements by the king, who is Richard II, and he will be a boy king in 1381. Edward III will die, and he lives long enough that his son, the Black Prince, dies before him. So when Edward III dies, his grandson, the Black Prince Edward, who would have been Edward IV but dies too early, his son, Edward III's grandson, will become king. But he's a kindergarten. He's a kid, not even elementary school age, when he becomes a king. So he's in charge of the army. He's in charge of the country. He's got 4 uncles, the brothers of Edward III, Edward the Black Prince. Sorry, his uncles are advising him, especially one uncle named John of Gaunt. This is going to be a problem because Edward III had so many kids that if there's something happens to Richard II, which there will be something that happens, there could be many possible kings, choices of kings. So later on, the number of relatives, because Edward III had the Black Prince and many other sons, the possibilities for who's going to become the king, that's going to be dynastic trouble later. Anyway, Richard II, he's a boy, but his uncles support him. Edward III was a very powerful warrior king, sort of like Richard the Lionheart, and he had good control over his family, and they all agreed that Richard II, the boy, would be the king. But to continue this war in France, under the conditions, the negative conditions, they are basically requiring the English people to work very hard, and they want them to. There's, as I said, one of the benefits of the Black Death is that there's less competition. There's still a lot of work to do, but there's less people, so you have to pay people more. The workers, the peasants, could ask for more. They could move to another village. If they weren't getting paid or weren't getting treated properly, they could just leave to another town, and there would always be like a labor shortage. So I guess it's a modern thing to say shop around, but they were like, look, they could move to different areas and demand more pay. And the wealthy people didn't like this, of course. They wanted to pay the peasants less, and they wanted them to stay on their land and do their job like a good serf should do, like fulfill your contract and do the work for your landlord, like the feudal relationship that William the Conqueror established. I'm in control, you all are my property, and you have to do your work because of the chain of being. You're born to be a peasant, do your work and stay where you're supposed to be, and know your role, right? But the Black Death sort of disrupted this. The 14th century is going to sort of wreck this hierarchy and this organization because, like I said, there was kind of an overpopulation, and after the population, collapses, this enables English peasants to assert themselves, assert their rights. So the main thing that they want is less tax. They want mobility. They want to be able to move and work where they want. So they want the pseudo slavery system where they have to stay and work for the landlord for their entire life, and then their children would have to, succeed them and do the same. They've had enough of that system, and they start a movement in Kent, which is the area of England next to London that's closest to France. They would be the ones that, when the French attacked, the first ones that would be attacked. And they're the ones that, they would be the ones that launch invasions across the channel too. So this is the area right next to London, between London and Brittany and Normandy on the English Channel. These people decide that they've had enough, and their leader is Wat Tyler. who was possibly a tiler, a roof tiler. His name might indicate that his trade was putting tiles on a roof, even though his name is spelled T-Y. Spelling in English is notoriously inconsistent. Tile is spelled like this, but it's, some people suggest that that might have been his job. But he's sort of upper middle class, you might say. He's skilled trade, but he's not a noble, and we don't know very much about him. He's one of the most famous unknown people in English history. But he became the leader of the movement, of the revolt, and Wat Tyler marches on London. On the way to London, they destroy everything they can. Documents, contracts, castles, churches. They burn and destroy everything they can, and they want, like I said, they want they want the wages to be allowed to increase. They want to be able to be paid. They want the taxes lowered, because there's Richard II and his uncles have need money for a war, so they just do a poll tax, which means everybody in England has to pay a certain amount of money. They don't want any universal taxes like that. You can imagine if Yoon Suk-yeol decided, the president of Korea just said, okay, everybody has to pay Baekmanwon because we need to have a war with another country. So everybody in the country has to pay Baekmanwon now. That would be an incredibly unpopular move. So he wouldn't do it. But we're going to come back to this idea. Some people like to use this catchy phrase, death and taxes, that for any society, that's going to be the breaking point. When people are dying and people are being when the government, then the country is demanding too much money, the burden of financial burden and the possibility of dying becomes too much. That's the breaking point for most societies, right? That's when there's some sort of rebellion, revolt, or revolution. So this is what basically happens. Wat Tyler, he's actually got some military experience. Probably he fought in France with the English military, and he's the leader. And they march on London, and they have complete control. Basically, the English soldiers are in France fighting. So the king doesn't have a whole lot of men to defend himself. But, and this is probably the greatest thing that Richard II ever did, he was brave, and he went out and he met them to negotiate, even though he's like 10 years old. And he goes out and he agrees to meet them. He stabilizes the situation. And then in the meeting, for one reason or another, the mayor of London attacks Wat Tyler. And nobody really knows exactly what happened, if he insulted the king or he threatened the king or whatever. But basically, the mayor, the Lord Mayor of London, a wealthy, important person, stabs Wat Tyler to death, kills him with a knife right there in front of him. So the leader is dead, just like that. And although there's thousands of peasants that still could have run up to the king, killed him, and taken over London if they wanted to, as soon as Wat Tyler is dead, they don't know what to do. They have no leadership. And the point wasn't really to kill Richard in the first place. What they wanted is, they thought that the wealthy uncles, the upper class, and his advisors are controlling the king, which is basically not true. He's going to grow up and he's going to be a tyrannical, unpopular king. But they don't know that, and they don't believe that the king wants to do these things, but that he's being misled. So they're trying to get King Richard, the boy, they believe that he's on their side. They're trying to save the king from the bad advice of the other rich people. But suddenly, they don't have a leader, and the king sends a whole bunch of knights and soldiers to chase them, and they scatter. Everybody, thousands of these peasants scatter. They run away from London and they go back to their villages and towns. And Richard II, the boy, claims that he's going to. The words exactly that he uses are famous. Rustics you are, and rustics you will remain, except even worse than before. So he seems like he's willing to negotiate. Wat Tyler dies. He scatters the revolt, and after the event, he's very angry that there was any resistance to his rule at all. So he punishes. He wants to get revenge, and he sends out soldiers and knights into the countryside to find all the leaders, and they are killed. And anybody who was associated with the revolt and the peasants' revolt and the resistance, anybody he could find, they would be arrested or killed. So this is 1381. This is the event that is known as the Peasants' Revolt. Don't be confused. There's peasants' revolts in Germany and France and Spain and other places. This is the English one. There are actually some larger ones in Germany, especially, but this is it's important for England because this revolt fails. Of course, Wat Tyler dies. The king gets revenge and everything, but Richard II behaves tyrannically, and he will be eventually deposed. And the things that the peasants wanted to have, the abolishment of the land requirement, like staying where you were born, where you belong, the feudal contract, right, where you can't move from one village to another or to another town, the increase in wages, that they tried to limit how much you were allowed to be paid, and the taxes. All of those things go away. All of those things, the things that they wanted, the things that they demanded, they get them. Not right away, because as I said, evolution, remember, but in the decades after the revolt, all of those things will happen, and this will create what we call the yeoman class. It's not going to create it, I shouldn't say create it, but it's going to make it possible for this kind of small farmer class, this group of English people, which really doesn't exist before that they will have their own land and they will work for themselves, and they will basically, it's not a middle class, so I don't want to really call it that, but they're independent, right? They're independent. They don't have to follow anybody's orders. They have their own wealth, and they can sell or move or produce their own wealth without being chained down to a lord or a lady or a wealthy person who owns their labor and oses their land. So this yeoman class, going into the 15th century, one of the positive things about the English society going into the 15th century will be this group of people that are sort of independently wealthy, and that will change English society permanently. And so it's a crisis. 14th century, there's a lot of negative things that happen, but they produce some positive results. I'm going to talk about some individuals who make contributions to. I just talked about Wat Tyler, but I'm also going to talk about some religious and literary influences. Geoffrey Chaucer is one of them, and how English language starts developing as well. Let me see what page. I call it a tumultuous century. Geoffrey Chaucer and John Wycliffe are the two people I'm going to talk about. Wycliffe was a religious figure, a Catholic monk. I'll talk about the importance of his ideas, and Geoffrey Chaucer, the poet, the man who wrote Canterbury Tales, and how they will influence later people like William Shakespeare and Queen Elizabeth II and Henry VIII and all those people in the 16th century, my favorite part of English history, how they will be affected by this. But the 14th century really is the turning point for English culture, and it'll set the sort of foundation for a lot of the things that we will look at for the rest of the course. 1453, the Turks, we mentioned the Crusades, the Ottoman Turks take Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, finally, after hundreds of years of getting smaller and shrinking, it falls apart, and the siege ends with the victory of Islam and the Turkish conquest of Istanbul. It's Constantinople, and later it'll be changed. Its name will be changed to Istanbul. That's the same year, coincidentally, that the 100 Years' War ends after 115 or 16 years. That ends, and France is victorious. England becomes just an island in the corner of Europe. Like I said, there's some positive changes in English society, but as far as like importance is concerned, England's influence also has shrunk, and France becomes bigger and stronger, more powerful. In Spain, certainly, in the 15th century, will create the first global empire, and England becomes like a regional power at best, not a significant kingdom. And but this is going to be the low point. The 15th century is going to be the low point of English and British culture, and so we'll talk about how things turn around going into the 16th century. Like I said, for me, the most interesting part of British history. So that's it for today. The War of the Roses also huge influence on Game of Thrones. That is the white rose and the red rose that are associated with the two houses, the House of York and the House of Lancaster, that struggle. And this is a civil war that adds to the sort of misery of the 14th century, is that England is fighting itself. So it's not able to do anything internationally because they're too busy trying to kill each other. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on Friday. Have a good day.